Well, hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Yonsei University US-China Rivalry Conference. Of course, we wish we could have all of you, both our panelists, who you'll be hearing from in a bit, and the attendees yourselves. We wish we could have you here in person to Yonsei University's campus. Night has fallen in Seoul, but it's beautiful out. The leaves are changing color, and so it's too bad we can't do this in 3 dimensions. On the bright side, the carbon footprint for this incredible global gathering is 0, and everyone is also free to take your masks off. So that's the one redemption to this. Not long before the pandemic hit, Yonsei University established the Center on Oceania Studies, which to our knowledge is the first of its kind in Korea, and that center is hosting our event tonight. A pretty amazing team of Yonsei students with connections to or interest in the Oceania region, joined by a recent graduate who's now getting his doctorate in maritime history at Harvard, have worked very hard to plan and pull off this conference, and I want to acknowledge their efforts right at the beginning. We as a group also want to acknowledge and thank the generous support that we received from the Asia Research Fund, which allowed our team to take on this ambitious project, and we're deeply grateful to ARF. Our center was established with the mission of exploring intellectual connections and deepening academic ties between the Korean Peninsula and Oceania, a vast region across the Pacific. As a child, I actually had the great fortune to travel to the islands of Fiji, Vanuatu, the Cooks, Papua New Guinea, the Solomons, and Australia. And those magical journeys shaped who I became as an adult. While I am certainly no expert on Oceania, I'm honored to serve as the director of our center and to help create platforms for the real experts. For tonight, our first major international conference, the Yonsei Oceania Center has brought together a really remarkable group of scholars from around the planet to help us understand one of the great dilemmas facing both Oceania and Korea, and indeed the entire Asia Pacific, if not the whole world. What does the emerging US-China rivalry mean to us and for us? Now, though I'm not an Oceania expert, US-China relations, thankfully, is a topic that falls in my own field of expertise. Trained in the discipline of history, I tend to look at the shifting dynamics in US-China relations unfolding before us now from the perspective of the past. From that angle, we're living in interesting times, as the curse goes. For it's been a long time indeed since these two nations and peoples saw one another through the prism of rivalry. At a minimum, one has to go back to the era before détente in 1972. That's already 50 years ago, to see what an openly hostile, rivalrous relationship looked like. If you go back another 20 years to 1952, you can see rivalry in its purest, most destructive form, as Chinese People's Volunteers and American UN forces fought, died, killed one another right here on the Korean Peninsula during what was in fact a Sino-American war in Korea. There was nothing cold about the Cold War rivalry between the US and China during the Korean War. Although that period prior to Nixon's visit to China is instructive, we should probably travel even further back in history to find the last time that the United States and China were, if not rivals, then something equally profound in its implications for the future, a time when they were equals. To be safe, we could go back to the early 1800s, when the United States was expanding across the North American continent and claiming hegemony over the Western Hemisphere, at the same time that the Qing dynasty in China ruled a continental empire as the hegemonic power in Asia. In other words, it's been about 200 years since Americans and Chinese could look upon one another in geopolitical terms as something approaching equals. This historical exercise alerts us to the fact that the world is watching something, if not completely new, then quite unfamiliar. Precedence for a US-China relationship as equals requires going back to the days of President James Monroe and the Daoguang Emperor. These are not household names in either Shanghai or San Francisco. To see in military terms what US-China rivalry looks like or looked like, you have to return to the days of Harry Truman and Mao Zedong, and it was not pretty. Now, these historical analogies are worth studying, or certainly I, as a historian, think so. But they do not make it any easier to predict what the emerging US-China rivalry will look like. Who will have the advantage in which arena of competition? Where does competition seem most likely to spill over into confrontation or conflict? And how will regions caught in the middle, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Oceania, how are they likely to respond or find ways to shape the story for themselves? It's in search of insights into those questions that we put together this conference on the US-China rivalry and the Biden Doctrine in the Asia Pacific, with 3 panel sessions held across the next 3 days, starting tonight in Asia, or in the morning in America, the afternoon in Europe. We have a dynamic mix of established voices and rising stars, speakers chiming in from Wellington and Canberra, Honolulu and Hong Kong, Washington and New York, Atlanta and Princeton, Beijing and Seoul, and not to forget Oslo. Now, before we plunge in to our first panel of scholars, I want to bring in a great diplomat and friend of the Oceania Centre, New Zealand's ambassador to the Republic of Korea, Philip Turner. Ambassador Turner has a distinguished career in the Foreign Service as well as the private sector. Even during the pandemic, he's found ways to host conversations with scholars and do the good work of diplomacy. And in my book, he exemplifies the best Kiwi values of openness, thoughtfulness, and inclusivity. We're thankful that Ambassador Turner accepted our invitation to say a few words of welcome for this event. I want to invite you, Phil, to take the Zoom.
Well, kia ora, John, and tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Now, that, as you all know, is a greeting in Te Reo Māori, which is the indigenous Māori language of New Zealand. So thanks very much, John, for that kind introduction. It's a great privilege and honor to speak at the outset of this fascinating event. US-China rivalry and the Biden Doctrine in the Asia Pacific. Well, I mean, as a New Zealander, I can't think of a more important topic to be discussing today. New Zealand, actually, when I was reflecting on this, is one of the few countries that is actually equidistant from both China and the United States. It's just 12 hours flying to each, very close. We are literally caught in the middle geographically. Ethnically, too, we're pretty mixed up. You know, New Zealand is made up of a majority of European origin people, but with a substantial population of Māori and other Pacific people. We have 5% of our population are Chinese in origin. We have a significant population from Korea, and so on. So, like many other countries in this part of the world, our economic and our security interests as well are intertwined with the region. And we have deep and complex relationships with both China and the United States. Now, how these two great powers manage their own relationship is of the highest importance to my country and to our region of Oceania and to the globe, I think. And just when we think the current situation is sufficiently complex and challenging, we get new developments to keep us on our toes. And I'm thinking about the recent announcement of the AUKUS agreement between the United States, UK, and Australia. And then there's China's recent notification of its desire to join CPTPP. That notification came directly to New Zealand, as we happen to be the depository body for CPTPP. So when I look at the agenda and the really impressive lineup of speakers that John's organized for tonight, so I'm not only honored to be speaking, to be giving some remarks in this way. Actually, my overwhelming feeling, however, is relief that I don't have to provide any of the answers to the questions that you guys are going to have to grapple with. I will, however, be paying very close attention to your answers. I promise not to grade, but I might take the odd note back to the teacher at home. So it'll be my great pleasure to sit back and listen to the expert panelists and speakers that John's organized for tonight. So let me kick that off by offering to, suggesting you all charge your glasses, as I'm doing here in the evening in Korea. And let's drink a toast to an insightful, fascinating, and instructive conference. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you so much, Phil. I wish I had something better to drink than a cup of Sprite here in a paper cup. But we really appreciate your words of wisdom and encouragement. And again, we appreciate the support that that the embassy gives to our project. So we're going to turn now to the main course of this opening session, which is going to be a panel discussion featuring experts from what I've been calling the 3 Ps: Peking University, Princeton University, and PRIO, the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. Before we start, I want to make 2 points of order. First, you are all very much encouraged to use the chat function to pose questions to the panelists. Our team is going to keep an eye on the messages, and we're going to do our best to get your question to our moderator later in the session for inclusion in the discussion. We've got a really great audience of attendees out there, and we want to involve you in the program. Second, I want to remind everyone that this is a public recorded event and that the center will be sharing excerpts, if not the entirety of the discussion. I'm also happy to say there are some great journalists out there tonight in the audience, and I want to remind the speakers that everything said is on record and for attribution. We do ask media as a courtesy to acknowledge the Yonsei University US-China Rivalry Conference. So now we're at the point where I get to turn things over to my colleague, Professor Moon Chung-in, who is, as most of you will know, one of the most prominent and insightful foreign affairs thinkers in South Korea. Earlier this year, he was appointed as chairman of the Sejong Institute. Before that, he served for a number of years in an official capacity as special advisor for foreign affairs and national security to the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in. Yonsei is proud to claim him as distinguished university professor, and we at the Oceania Center are delighted that he agreed to add his thoughts on the topic, to introduce our speakers for the panel, and to moderate the subsequent discussion. So with that, I want to turn to you, Professor Moon.
John, thank you. You're very media savvy. You know how I think our university should appoint you as the director in charge of international media. You're the only Yonsei faculty who knows how to boost Yonsei image internationally. Anyhow, with that credit, let me go to my session. Our session will be talking about the U.S.-China rivalry. John titled it as the clash of nations. There are only two nations, okay, China and the United States. When you talk about China-US relations, it started with engagement and moves into cooperation and competition. But since the Trump administration now, the US is talking about rivalry and even animosity. And I know that China-US relations are located which coordinate, and the Biden administration is talking about competitive, strategic competition or competitive coexistence. There must between cooperation and competition. But Chinese would think that even though China does not want, going beyond competition, it is much more rivalry, even animosity. Well, we are able to put together. I think John was able to put together really wonderful panelists here. We have, John Ikenberry, as you all know, that he is a captain of liberal internationalism. Now he is recently talking about the deep engagement, and he has strong supporters as well as a strong opponent too. Particularly John has become more controversial than ever before with his vision of, American foreign policy on the global level. And he wrote the famous book, The After Victory, and which I even used as a textbook. And since then on, he has been really focusing on the changing global order and how to inject liberal values in the evolution of world order. Therefore, I think he should be able to give a very good overview of Biden policy on China. And also he has been closely advising the Biden administration. Another, panelist is Wang. He's a rising star. He was a rising star, but now he's a rising star. He has gotten big grant from Chinese Ministry of Education, over $10 million, and he's a very rich researcher. He has many staff, and his institute is called the China-US relations, the Institute on the China-US relations, whatever. He will explain later. But Wang has been a prolific writer, and I have attended several workshops and conferences with him. He's most analytical and precise and fact-based. He's less, let's say, contaminated by ideology of his country, but he's more factual, more open. Therefore, I think that he will be able to give a very big picture of Chinese foreign policy and its relations with the United States. And again, Wang Zhong got his PhD from UCLA. Therefore, he is, endowed with American intellectual tradition, but now he's trying to be more independent in terms of his analytical thinking. And therefore, we have one panelist from the US, another from China. And in fact, John and I talk about who would be good, and we need some neutral third party. I don't know whether Norway is neutral or not, but I know Stein Tønnesson, he's a neutral. Okay, Stein Tønnesson served as the director of PRIO, Oslo Peace Research Institute, for 10 years, and he stepped down. He initiated a big project called the East Asia Peace, associated with the Uppsala University in Sweden, and he published several books on East Asian peace. Now, there's a big argument whether his thesis on East Asian peace is right or no. 10 years ago, it was right proposition, but now, in the light of China-US strategic competition or rivalry, now a lot of people are questioning whether Stein Tønnesson's East Asia peace proposition is right or no, correct or not, but maybe he can talk about it later. But it is very lucky for us to have Stein Tønnesson as a so-called third-party neutral observer. And also Stein Tønnesson won the International Studies Association Book Award on his book on Vietnam from 1945 to 48 time period. And that book was very well received. But one thing, after having read so many works by Stein Tønnesson, I can tell he's less biased, less ideological, and more factual, more historical. Therefore, I think he will be a kind of neutral umpire in making comments on John and Dong. Okay, you will be given maximum 15 minutes each. Okay, and that will be followed by group discussion. After that, I will open to the floor. I will be getting the comments and questions from the floor. But please keep that in mind. We have more journalists than the scholars. Okay, we have journalists from the New York Times, Guardian, and Korea Times, whatever. Therefore, John Delury is very good at mobilizing those journalists. Therefore, please keep that in mind. Okay, and maybe they will be raising some questions and comments too. Okay, with this rather brief introduction, I will start with John Ikenberry. John?
Thank you, Chung-in. It's great to be here. And John, thank you for your leadership. Chung-in, it's great to see you, and thank you for chairing this panel. And I very much look forward to the discussion. We are meeting, as John said, in interesting times. Globally, the world system, the world order seems to be convulsing with at least three grand crises simultaneously. One is what we might call the geopolitical crisis, what political scientists call power transition problems of a movement from a period where the US was dominant, the so-called unipolar period, to one where China is a rival, where the system is more multipolar, where there's contestation among great powers. And it's happening, of course, with China and the United States, where the two countries are not just great powers, but very different kinds of historical entities, culturally, ideologically, and so forth. And I'll say something about that in a minute. The second crisis is the crisis of modernity. We are in the midst of a planetary environmental crisis. Global warming is coming faster and more severely than we had thought even a few years ago. And it's not just climate change, of course, it's pandemics. It's all the problems of the 21st century that affect all of us. And then finally, speaking from someone living in the United States, there's a crisis of liberal democracy, of the what we often call the gold standard of modern polities. Accountable, rule of law democracies are not what they used to be. They're struggling with polarization, with inequality, and in the United States, racial reckoning. So it's in this context that the US and China are eyeing each other. And under the Biden administration, as this new administration navigates these crises and looks at China, I think we can say that it has increasingly crystallized a new grand strategy focused on the rise of China as a peer competitor and gearing up for a long-term struggle, a kind of twilight struggle with China over basic issues of how the world should and can be organized. Now, for most of my professional career, we have been debating what the rise of China means. Will the rise of China be a peaceful process? Will China be a responsible stakeholder? Will it integrate into the world capitalist democratic order dominated by these established democracies, or will it seek to upend and contest that order? Will engagement of China, which has been a major part of American grand strategy since the 1990s, welcoming China into the liberal international order, into the WTO, create incentives for China to converge on the great issues of politics and economics, the so-called liberal bet that China would find itself more rich, more powerful, and hopefully more liberal in one way or another. And the question of what kind of challenge is China? Is it a geostrategic, economic, ideological challenge, or all of the above? And how will, in an era of intensified US-China competition, how will countries inside and outside of Asia react and align themselves in this growing competition? In Washington and with the Biden administration, I think these grand questions that we've been asking for several decades look increasingly clear, clearly have answers, that there are settled conclusions we can draw about China. And I think the Biden administration, I don't speak for them, but I observe them closely. Again, I don't speak for them. I'm an academic looking at Washington, looking at American foreign policy. I think they see China increasingly as a full spectrum challenger to the US global position. The CIA, Bill Burns recently said in announcing a new China Center that the most important geopolitical threat to the United States we face in the 20th century is China. Yes, China is deeply embedded in the global system and in the world economy. We must cooperate, and there is an extensive agenda for cooperation waiting to be seized. But the US and China increasingly are strategic rivals with very different visions of world order, resting on divergent developmental and order building interests and values. The US wants to make the world safe for democracy. That doesn't mean spreading democracy worldwide, but it does mean creating a system, a global system that allows liberal democracies to be safe and secure. And at the same time, China clearly wants a world to make itself safe and secure, safe for the Communist Party and for political autocracy, which is its political model. The US believes, as it has for 2 centuries, that it is safer in a world where the liberal democracies hold sway. China contests that order, and therein lies the grand strategic rub. Now, Biden has moved in this context to place long-term strategic competition with China at the center of American grand strategy. You can see the ending of the Afghan war, abrupt, chaotic, as not as a retreat from strategic military leadership, but of strategic rebalancing, repositioning resources and commitments for this coming struggle. The new grand strategy organized around balance of power, hegemonic competition, struggle to shape the logic of the global system is now in front of us. There are several convictions, I think 5 or 6 key points that perhaps I can put on the table for discussion that I think capture this American reorientation of its grand strategy. The first one, which I've already introduced, is that China is now, as it's grown more powerful, as it's grown more wealthy, is increasingly a systemic rival. The term systemic rival, it seems to me, is very helpful in capturing what the nature of the challenge is. China seeks to contest, to weaken, to shrink America's liberal hegemonic presence in the world, paving the way to elevate China's leadership, seeking to push the world in a different direction in terms of institution, rules, and values. President Xi seems to accept this view, arguing that China now no longer needs to defer to the United States, but has its own leadership role on an equal level playing field. China is a systemic rival because it challenges the full spectrum of US power, interests, and values: military power, alliances and alignments, markets and trade, money and finance, next generation technology, research, education, and ideology and values. So that's number one. Number two, the engagement strategy that began in the 1990s is widely seen in Washington and in the Biden administration as having failed. Inviting China into the WTO, maybe that was a mistake. It made China wealthy, but it also made China a more capable challenger. And it hasn't led to a more liberal China, but in fact to a less liberal China, an anti-liberal, anti-democratic, autocratic state. Americans are shocked by China today under President Xi. The attack on democracy in Hong Kong, the oppression of the Uyghurs, the intimidation of Taiwan, the territorial aggrandizement in the South China Sea, the crackdown on Western influences inside of China, the cult-like elevation of President Xi thinking, all of this are markers for the path that China is following. That's their choice, but it does suggest that the idea of a kind of liberal bet, of inviting China into the liberal order with the idea that we will find ourselves increasingly converging on the most basic questions of politics and economics has not occurred. Thirdly, the US cannot balance against Chinese illiberal hegemony alone. It needs allies and partners. And this is really, I think, a critical feature of the Biden grand strategy, working with allies, looking for partnerships. Biden at the UN used the term allies 6 times in his speech and double that usage of the term partnerships. You see this everywhere in some sense. The Quad, the US, UK, Australian Pact, not a Cold War bloc of the free world against the non-free world, but more floating ad hoc coalitions driven by more local circumstances, creating counterweights of one kind or another. Fourthly, there is a strong sense that this competition is not really fully a kind of Cold War competition, but it ultimately hinges on how we get our own houses in order, that the US has a lot of domestic problem solving to do. We're a troubled country in many ways. Economically, we're more unequal than ever before. I've mentioned the polarization, the very kind of survival of liberal democracy. There are authoritarians in our midst who seek to roll back basic rights of voting and rule of law and so forth. So there's a struggle at home to create a more perfect union, to use American rhetoric. And in the end, the long-term struggle with China will hinge as much on whether the United States and other liberal democracies can get their house in order, can show that liberal democracy works. This is clearly what Biden believes, and you see it in his New Deal type domestic program of rebuilding American society through infrastructure, supporting education, and the social safety net. Fifth, the competition of the 21st century is going to hinge on not just military competition. Indeed, that may be less important than ever before, although not unimportant, but rather it hinges on rules and institutions, on the regulatory standards for cyber and the internet, protocols for artificial intelligence, new age technology platforms, communications technologies. And in these different areas, we have to remember that rules and institutions, that multilateralism is not value neutral, that there is a struggle going on to determine whether those rules, whether they be in trade or technology, embody standards and values that liberal democracies hold dear. So trade agreements that provide, as the TPP does, rights of labor, independent labor unions, the rights of child labor standards, environmental standards. There is a struggle going on inside of global institutions and rules to tilt those rules in one direction or another towards creating an environment that is more protective of liberal democratic values, or those that are more protective of autocratic and authoritarian values. And it matters whether there is a critical mass of countries that want to move it one direction or the other. These are platforms that no one country can dominate. So there's a competition there which will really determine the nature of the global system in the decades ahead. And then finally, there is the great challenge of defining a positive relationship between the United States and China. And while that has not captured the headlines today as much as the strategic competition, which I've been illuminating, I hope, there is a huge agenda here for Chinese and Americans of goodwill to work together, even as they compete on climate change first and foremost. The two countries, China, 24% of emissions of carbon today, the United States, 17%. Between the two countries, 40+% of global carbon emissions are coming from our two countries. And so we do have a responsibility, a practical and indeed moral responsibility to work together, and to do so without asking the other that we will only cooperate if you pull your punches on one issue or another. Don't complain to us about our efforts to dominate Taiwan, because if you do, we aren't going to work with you on climate change. That won't work. That's not a strategy that's going to work. It's like saying, if you don't stop talking about human rights, I'm going to shoot myself with a gun. That it's self-interested behavior that brings China and the United States to the table on climate change, regardless of our disagreements on other issues. Finally, let me just say there are two sources of restraint, I think, on Chinese and American grand strategy that give us an opportunity to build a constructive form of competition. On the Chinese side, the big restraint on China foreign policy is what diplomatic historians call the problem of self-encirclement. As China pushes outward, it alienates other countries that are its neighbors. It's the problem of Germany in the post-Bismarck era of triggering balancing against you by virtue of your aggressive behavior that to you looks defensive, but to the outside world, it looks offensive. And so China has to find some way to signal restraint, that it is a peaceful, cooperative, great power that can be a positive source for, in building a 21st century world order. That's in its interest. And that at some point will kick in and provide some restraint on President Xi's aggressiveness. And then on the American side, America's allies don't want a Cold War with China. They don't want to choose between China and the United States. Remarkably, 100 countries in the world have twice as much trade with China than with the United States. Countries that are allied with the United States for security are tied to China for trade and investment. And so there is a basic complexity to the alignment system that makes it harder for the United States, even if it wanted to, but I don't think it does, to push this towards a Cold War, because countries on the front line don't want to live in that kind of world. So there are restraints on the two superpowers and incentives for them to compete to show the world that a world where they are dominant or prominent in leadership is a world that other countries want to live in. And that would be, if that is the dynamic, prescription for constructive competition that can make us all better off at the end of this long twilight struggle.
John, thank you for your very insightful and precise, presentation. Now, Wang Dong.
Thank you. Thank you, Chung-in. Thank you, John, so much for inviting me. I'm not sure I'm maybe the only one who actually follow very strictly the instruction given by John to me, which is the how to structure my essay and the presentation. When I listen to John, another John Ikenberry, well, that is a very different kind of way of presenting his idea, his analysis. So I was asked by John to comment on or look at Beijing's approach to the strategic competition, unfolding strategic competition between China and the United States. So I actually also give it a title. I call it a reluctant rival. So that's basically my assessment of Beijing's approach, how Beijing sees this competition, and how it sort of design its strategies in dealing with that. So we all know now that in the past few years, US-China relations have witnessed a dramatic downward spiral, unseen actually since normalization. So the 4-decade-long policy of strategic engagement with China has been abandoned. John just mentioned that. Washington began to view China as the biggest competitor and adversary, a revisionist, authoritarian power that is bent on challenging American primacy and hegemony. The Trump administration had launched a disruptive trade war against China, pursued a damaging decoupling of the two economies, imposed sanctions on China's high-tech companies such as Huawei, and carry out witch hunt of scientists accused of quote-unquote stealing American technologies on behalf of the Chinese government, and attacked Beijing on Xinjiang, COVID, etc., and even publicly called for a new Cold War against China. So one might just suggest that the Trump-China policy actually had come very close to a new containment. The Biden administration has inherited Trump's idea of strategic competition between China and the United States, and still sees China as the biggest rival to American leadership and hegemony. And the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's tripartite framework that describes the U.S.-China relationship as quote-unquote competitive, it should be collaborative, it can be, and adversarial, it must be, has become the de facto China policy of the Biden administration. Strategic competition has become the hallmark of Biden's China policy, but unlike Trump, Biden has chosen a policy mixed of limited competition and a partial decoupling with China to prevent the conflict from escalating into a new Cold War. Another feature, I think, of Biden's policy that also separates him from Trump is that Biden actually has been quite effective in mobilizing alliances and partners to join hands in countering China. When Trump, one interesting thing is that when Trump won the US presidential election back in 2016, many in China actually had very high expectations in him, believing that as a businessman turned president, Trump would be someone China could, quote unquote, strike a deal with. And Beijing's hope ran high when Trump took a visit to China in November 2017. Trump came back from Beijing with a US dollar, I think $250 billion US dollar deal. And Trump's about face, the release of the December 2017 National Security Strategy Report that labeled China as a main competitor, and also the quickly escalating trade war actually took Beijing by surprise. Refusing to cave into Trump's what Beijing calls trade bullying, 贸易霸凌主义, China took a tit-for-tat approach toward Trump's trade war. When Biden took office, China did not expect Biden to completely reverse the bilateral relationship, but nevertheless still place some hope that Biden might help stabilize the bilateral relations a little bit. Indeed, it can be said that bringing China-U.S. relations back to the right track, in Chinese meaning 推动中美关系重回正轨, remains the key goals of China's policy towards the United States since Biden came into power. So watching closely Biden's every move, Beijing was very sensitive and indeed indignant when the Biden administration claimed that it would deal with China from the position of strength. On issue involving its core interest, Beijing has made it clear that it will not bow to the pressure from Washington. During their first high-level China-US meeting that took place in Anchorage, Alaska, back in March, Chinese senior political leader and top diplomat Jiang Jiechi, along with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang warned their U.S. counterpart, Blinken and Jake Sullivan, that, quote unquote, the United States does not qualify to speak to China in a condescending way or from a position of strength, explicitly opposing the manner the United States has adopted in dealing with China. Meanwhile, Beijing was reluctant to reciprocate to Biden's posture of seeking, quote unquote, long-term stiff competition with China. At the Tianjin talks in July, China made it clear to the United States that the U.S. side should not fantasize about demanding from China on issues of cooperating while infringing on China's core interest, and also criticize Blinken's tripartite framework as aiming at seeking rivalry. And at the most recent Zurich talks, China actually opposed defining China-U.S. relations on purely competitive terms. And I think this is very interesting to think about this, why China, even up to nowadays, still refuses to come along with the American definition that the U.S.-China relations is a strategic competition. Then I will quickly look at the four realms that I was instructed to look at. First, geopolitics. I think the Biden administration inherited the Indo-Pacific strategy and also focusing on mastering a network of regional allies and partners such as Japan, India, Australia, etc., in order to counterbalance China. And many in China actually views the Indo-Pacific strategy as a strategy of encirclement and containment of China. And after elevating the Quad into a leader-level summit, the United States announced an enhanced trilateral security alliance with the UK and Australia, somewhat awkwardly called AUKUS, which among other things seeks to help Australia build a nuclear-powered submarine fleet in the coming decades. Facing the Biden administration's strategic moves, China's rational approach would be try to draw close the U.S. allies and partners such as Japan, Australia, and India. However, hamstrung by several complicating factors such as the pandemic, territorial disputes with India and with Japan, as well as trade disputes, China saw a rise in tension with Japan, Australia, and India instead. So with Washington ratcheting up strategic pressures against China, Beijing opted to strengthen its strategic partner with Russia. Not surprisingly, including stepping up its military cooperation with Moscow and elevating the scale and the sophistication of China-Russia joint naval exercise in the region. While trying to maintain durable deterrence posture, China also tried to actually avoid further escalation of border disputes with India. Meanwhile, China has also stepped up its engagement with ASEAN countries. In short, in countering increasingly fierce geopolitical pressures orchestrated by Washington, Beijing believes that a stable enabling environment remains the basis for an overall strategy toward the United States. Next, geoeconomics. The Biden administration took what might be called selective multilateralism, aiming at restraining China's expanded economic influence. For example, the Biden administration pushed the G2 to launch the B3W partnership, a major strategic initiative to counter the Belt and Road Initiative. It has also promoted the reconstruction of global industrial chain to reduce reliance on China's supply chain. In key economic areas, selective or precise decoupling and the de-Sinacization were enforced. On the one hand, Biden signed the executive order on American supply chains to assess supply chain resilience in major economic areas related to China, including semiconductor manufacturing, new energy battery, rare mineral, and pharmaceutical supplies. On the other hand, the United States has stepped up coordination with its European and Asian allies to create a U.S.-centric supply chain, excluding China. In response, Beijing has repeatedly made known its opposition to the U.S. decoupling policy. Seeing the growing uncertainties and risks in the global market, Beijing has developed a dual circulation strategy, aiming at building a new development pattern that prioritizes domestic circulation, meaning expanding domestic demands and market with domestic and international circulations reinforcing each other. Leveraging on its advantage of having full range of industrial categories and systems and the pivotal position it occupies in the global supply chains, Beijing aims to upgrade its industrial system and the supply chain so as to withstand potential external uncertainties and shocks. In an April Foreign Affairs article, I actually offer a criticism of what I call the old new engagement consensus, the bipartisan consensus that John just mentioned, that actually look forward to aiming at bringing that sees China as the other. And I actually argue that there is a very serious epistemological fallacy in this old engagement consensus, because to begin with, it sees China as quote unquote the other, that is to be transformed, to be integrated, to be led into a US dominated so-called liberal order. And the expectation is that China will over time will liberalize itself first economically and over time politically. And when that didn't happen, I think that was time that I think the American elites really was disappointed and sort of shift to another dramatic shift of their, I think, way of looking at China. And I would like to also use one fable in Asian China, try to illustrate this point. It is called 刻舟求剑. In Chinese, literally translated as to carving a mark on the side of the boat, try to retrieve the lost sword. What does it mean? The story goes that in ancient China, a gentleman who carried a sword and he was about to board the ferry to get across the river. And in the middle of that, he accidentally dropped his sword into the river. And all the passengers cry out, "Sir, sir, you dropped your sword into the river." And he said, "Never mind." He brings up his knife and he make a carve on the side of the boat. And he says, "This is the place where I dropped my sword." And then as soon as the boat reached ashore, and he jumped into the river from the mark he made on the side of the boat, and in the hope of trying to retrieve the sword. And of course he failed. And the analogy I was trying to make here is that this expectation that China would one day liberalize itself economically and politically, one day sort of follow the American way, American model, is just this mark this gentleman make on the car side of the boat that decades ago. And of course, you will not find that. So my point is that perhaps the United States need to think more critically about the fallacy, the epistemological fallacy in this old engagement consensus. And I actually suggest that a new engagement consensus might develop in the coming decades. It is a possibility. The new engagement consensus would not view China as the other that must be transformed, must be led into a US dominant order, but rather it will allow for an order in which the United States and China would coexist while continuing to compete in a constructive and a positive sum manner, rather than in a confrontational zero-sum manner. And I also suggest in my article that instead of pursuing a damaging, completing decoupling of the two economies, Washington and Beijing might be able to recouple their economy on a new basis of reciprocity. And coincidentally, and perhaps not so on account of a coincidence, I found the term recoupling that I coined in my foreign affairs article actually got into U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai's recent conversation on Biden's trade policy, in which she actually acknowledged that decoupling of Chinese and American economies in an era of globalization is impossible, and we should rather think in terms of recoupling. John, how much time I still have? If not, then I probably just skip to toward the end and conclude.
I think maybe wrap up if you stick to the 15 on my clock.
Okay, already 15. All right, so I will skip the high tech and the value part and just conclude. So I think my observation is that Beijing is truly it's also quite interesting. I'm still trying to figure out why this is the case. China is a reluctant rival in this competition game. China is not willing to take the initiative to provoke conflict with the United States and hopes that the US-China relations can stabilize. But in face of the US heavy-handed pressure in defense of its primacy and hegemony, and Beijing sees no choice but to resolutely defend its own right to development. And most recent, I think it's also, I want to mention this, I think the most recent, the US Secretary of Commerce, I think she in one meeting with her European counterparts says something I think quite extraordinary. It's really shocking here for many Chinese. She basically says the United States and Europe should work together to quote unquote slow the innovation rate of China. People here really sense some sort of racism, sort of discrimination here. So China does not have the right to develop. China cannot innovate. And you have to ask, many people are actually asking this kind of questions. So Beijing, I think, recognized the prospects of a long-term standoff between China and the United States. That is, neither one can replace or overthrow the other over a long period of time. So the two have to coexist. China is reluctant to compete, let alone challenge American hegemony. So John, in his presentation, actually have listed a lot of things, a lot of goals, a lot of areas, realms that China seeks to challenge American primacy or the international norms. I actually, beg to differ, but maybe we can get into discussion. We can have a bit of exchange of views during Q&A. Nevertheless, I think Beijing is also realistic. So it is prepared for the worst case scenario as well. But nevertheless, I think stabilizing US-China relations and prevent it from spiraling into conflict remains a key goal of China's policy toward the United States. I will stop here. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Wang Song. Now, Stein Tønnesson.
Thank you very much. Here comes the third force. In the title for this webinar are three entities. It's the United States, China, and the world. And I'm deeply honored to have been asked to represent the world. Wang Dong spoke about the United States trying to other China. I'm trying here to other both China and the United States as great powers engaged in a rivalry that the rest of the world does not want. I was deeply happy to hear John Ikenberry say that there is a whole long agenda for cooperation between China and the United States waiting to be seized. I feel that it's urgent to seize it and to overcome the rivalry. And I try in my talk to establish a global we with a list of interests to be advocated by all the rest of the world, and where we must try to persuade China and the United States to fulfill our visions. And I have 8 points. The first and top priority in the world today is to halt climate change. It threatens humanity, it threatens life on the earth. There will be the most important summit that is happening is the one that will happen in Glasgow later this month. I'm happy that Biden will be there. I'm sorry that Xi Jinping probably will not travel there. We should step up our pressure on the great powers so they can use their capabilities to help the world, save the world from all the disasters threatened by climate change. My second point builds on my own research in the past, and that is to sustain the East Asian peace. East Asia is today the most valid candidate for being the center of the world. Its drive has been driving the world economy for the last 20 years at least. And this would never have happened had not East Asia been at peace. East Asia is experienced the worst wars in the world in the first 30, 40 years after the Second World War. But since the 1980s, East Asia has been astoundingly peaceful, and this, Chung-in, is still the case today. The rivalry between the United States and China has not taken the form of confrontations, but it risks doing so. The East Asian peace has been at risk all the time it has lasted because a number of disputes in the region have not been resolved. In Korea, in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, between India and China. But some have also been resolved, so as for instance, the border dispute between Vietnam and China, which was the area where the last big war was fought in East Asia from 1979 to 1987. What we call upon the great powers to do, China and the United States, is to get together and establish crisis prevention measures, because with the current animosity and distrust between them, there is every risk that an acute crisis situation will emerge in one place or another, perhaps in cyber. So all the work that is done by the People's Liberation Army and the US Armed Forces to try to prevent such things from happening are in the interest of the world community. I would also say that I warn against the establishment of new alliances. The existing alliances that have been there since the Cold War may be stabilizing, but attempts to create new alliance systems can disturb the balances and create fear instead of deterrence. I warn also against the whole concept of an Indo-Pacific. The Asia-Pacific was a fully acceptable term because it includes all of Asia, including China. But the Indo-Pacific term must create a feeling in China that one is trying to marginalize China from an area where India and the United States have a common interest. I would also warn against widening the scope of NATO operations or NATO policies to include China. The NATO should concentrate on security in Europe itself, where it's badly needed and where you need a resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. So these are all measures to sustain and prolong and deepen the East Asian peace instead of setting it at risk, as is happening at the moment. The third point on my agenda, my global WEAS agenda, is to stop economic decoupling. It's so easy to use dual-use terminology to prevent trade and technological exchange between countries. So there should be work done to establish where the borderlines go between what must and can be done out of concern for national security and what should be considered as normal trade. And I would very much hope to see an agenda in the Trans-Pacific Partnership for getting both China and the United States as members, and perhaps also the United States could join the RCEP. It's a travesty that the Doha round of the World Trade Organization has not led to any results. So reinvigoration of the World Trade Organization is also on my agenda under this point. The fourth point is simply to reinforce the United Nations. The United Nations has had the great success of remaining an organization for the whole world since 1945. It played a significant role in the decolonization process that led to the creation of so many recognized states. It had a very productive role just after the Cold War, when it was more easy than before to obtain unanimity in the UN Security Council. Now this has been problematic again, but I think there is a chance for the UN now to work on a crisis of extreme importance for East Asia, which is the one in Myanmar, together with ASEAN. And that leads me to the fifth point, which is to strengthen regional organizations. And here I concentrate on ASEAN, although I could give much praise also to the EU's ability to overcome the crisis created by Brexit. Strengthen ASEAN, I think, has two big purposes. The first is that ASEAN has played a significant role in maintaining peace among its members. The second is that it has provided frameworks for cooperation in East Asia as a whole. And in fact, the East Asian Summit is going on now from tomorrow, but virtually this time, led from Brunei Darussalam as the chair of ASEAN. And on their agenda is the crisis in Myanmar, which is really driving Myanmar into a tragedy where you have violence and lack of governance, and at the same time, a deep health crisis caused by the pandemic. It should be a global key concern to try to overcome that crisis. In the same way as there are similar crises in Afghanistan, in Syria, and now also in Ethiopia and lately Sudan. But with the Myanmar crisis, ASEAN has a special role. Both the UN Security Council and China have kind of delegated to ASEAN main responsibility for Myanmar. And it has taken the wise decision to not invite the deeply unpopular dictator Min Aung Hlaing to its summit. The next chair of ASEAN will be Cambodia. And that one might perhaps think that Cambodia is too small and has too few resources to play a role. But actually, Cambodia benefited from the Paris Agreement of 1991, which ended the cycle of wars in Indochina. So it has benefited itself from a UN ASEAN peace initiative. It is a Buddhist country, just like Myanmar, and it has close relations with China. I believe, Wang Dong, that China has not at all looked happily at the coup in Myanmar. China has backed up 3 statements in the United Nations Security Council criticizing the junta, and China has very close relations with Cambodia. These close relations hampered Cambodia's role in ASEAN last time Cambodia was chair, because then the matter was about the South China Sea, where Cambodia did not play along with the other ASEAN powers. This time, Cambodia's relations with China could be a great advantage, because China does not want to go it alone in Myanmar, but also does not want the West to have too much influence, but it could work with Cambodia through ASEAN to force out Min Aung Hlaing, obtain the release of Aung San Suu Kyi, re-establish her as state councillor, and perhaps get some kind of coalition government where also the military could be represented by more reasonable officers than the ones who are running the country into a tragedy today. My sixth agenda point is to shape a transparent digital order. I find it deeply regretful that China is in one social media world, while most of the rest of the world is in another, because China is hiding itself behind a digital firewall with only a few gates between the rest of the world and China. Very few people outside China use WeChat or Sina Weibo. People in China do not have access to the social media that we use in the rest of the world. This has been part of a kind of division that has interrupted the digital communication and the exchange of ideas that is deeply needed in a globalized world. So one should develop a kind, perhaps under UN auspices, some kind of convention on a digital order, where one would also work on the problem that the big media giants play both in the United States and the rest of the world, and in China, where indeed there are some similar concerns in the governments. My seventh point is to overcome authoritarianism. And here I must say that I agree with much of John Ikenberry's description of recent developments. It's not just China that has become more authoritarian. There has been an authoritarian trend for several years now in many of the world's nations, but indeed it has also characterized China with harder repression, with less academic freedom, and with more surveillance, and also with the clampdown on rights in Hong Kong, which has deeply worried people also in Taiwan, so that Taiwan is now unimaginable that the Taiwanese will want any reunification with China after the way Hong Kong has been treated. But I believe that the chance for China to move out of this authoritarian trend and again loosen up the controls a little in the way that it happened in the 1990s and early 2000s, that the chance for that to happen would increase with more communication and more cooperation. It will not increase with the kind of antagonization that we see from the United States side under both Trump and Biden. My last point is to uphold international law. And here it's perhaps the easiest point to other the two great powers, because the part of international law that I will mention here as an example is the law of the sea. And in the law of the sea, both great powers are at fault. The United States has not ratified it, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which will have its 40th anniversary next year. The United States does not accept that areas outside of national continental shelves, the area as it's called in the convention, that it represents the heritage of mankind, and that anyone exploiting resources in those areas must pay dues to a UN agency. China accepts that because China has that kind of global social conscience. On the other hand, the key value of the law of the sea is its inherent peacefulness, which should suit China. And why is the law of the sea so peaceful? It's peaceful because it defines sovereign rights at sea through distances from coasts, and not from actual control, administration, or conquest, like is in the case on land. And this is what China does not respect in the South China Sea. China behaves in the South China Sea as if it, as just one nation, can possess virtually the whole of the sovereign rights in the whole South China Sea, when actually that sea is surrounded by a number of states. This behavior in the South China Sea creates deep suspicion against China in the rest of the world, and is something that I think that we, the global we, should call upon repeatedly on China during the 40th anniversary next year to revise its approach and show respect for international law. Let me end a little humorously by telling you that my name is Tønnesson, and for many years I have repeatedly been exposed to text messages and emails where people call me Tønnesson instead of Tønnesson, because my name is changed by the word processors or by correction software. And for a long time, I felt this as irritating, until I read this book, The Parliament of Man, which is about the history of the United Nations by Paul Kennedy, and where he starts on the opening page by quoting Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem Locksley Hall from 1837, which appears to be exactly down my alley because he is promoting the idea of a United Nations. He speaks of first in some verses of the wars that ravaged the world, and then he says, "Till the war drum throbbed no longer and the battle flags were furled, in the Parliament of Man, the federation of the world, there the common sense of most shall hold the fretful realm in awe, and the kindly earth shall slumber, leapt in universal law." Thank you very much. If he had lived today, he would have added a verse on climate change. Thank you.
Chung-in, I think you're muted.
Stein, thank you very much. My original plan was supposed to raise, questions to the panelists, but I have already 6 questions from the floor. Therefore, I will go to the floor directly. First question is from the Yukuta Tagi. Okay, I think that really addresses to both John and Wang. That how will Chinese pragmatic targets through 2035 will possibly affect U.S.-China relations or change in the worldview of China as an authoritarian country? I don't clearly understand that one, but by year 2035, President Xi Jinping wanted to create, a strong Chinese strong army dream, okay? And maybe he was referring to it or not. And also, he or, Tiagi's, another question related to it was, what about China seeing India as a major threat? Maybe, Wang Dong, you can ask on this question. Does China see India as a major threat?
Okay. Thank you, Chung-in. Well, I think honestly, I really don't think the China sees India as a major threat, and indeed, we might remember before. I think the most recent the border disputes flared up. I think back, this year, last year, and also again 2017, Doctrine. The Chinese leaders, President Xi and also India Prime Minister Modi, they were trying actually very hard, and also trying to improve the bilateral relations. A lot of summit meeting, visits, etc. Generally speaking, I think that China sees India. So in that process, China really wanted to had a stable and cooperative relations with India. But unfortunately, I think because of the flare up of the recent border disputes, and from the Chinese perspective, of course, there was India was being too aggressive, trying to change the status quo on the ground. But nevertheless, I think China, as I also mentioned in my presentation, China was also trying to stabilize, de-escalate the conflict with India, and that's why I think both sides are actually, as we are speaking, they are engaging in talks by the military leaders on the ground, and things I think are moving sort of gradually, but still I think it's a complicated story there, because India also has a highly nationalistic, populist and political environment, and if you just look at, if you compare, spend some time compare the media reports coverage of those stories, and you'll be shocked by how nationalistic, how irrational, I mean how radical the Indian stories are. But by contrast, you probably won't see many Chinese media, reports saying, well, India is our threat and we should to teach them a lesson. You rarely see that kind of coverage.
Okay, John, let me just put it in this way. Okay, the Chinese government has set up the year 2035 as a year of achieving strong army, and year 2049, the 100th anniversary of founding of People's Republic of China, as a year to transform from developing socialist country into the developed country. But a lot of folks in Washington tend to interpret that the Chinese goal is to secure regional hegemony in Asia Pacific by 2035. And by 2049, China wanted to have a global dominance. That is written by, Jake Sullivan's writing at Foreign Affairs, really make that point, even Kurt Campbell too. What is your take on their interpretation? Do you think that their perception is real or very much contrived?
Well, I think it's hard to look at the shifting power relations in the world today and not see that what we are confronting is an emerging rivalry between China and the United States for regional and global hegemony. It would be a extraordinary episode in world history, unlike anything we've seen before, if that were not the case. China may not have designs that are fully elaborated, but it has a position in the world where it will seek inevitably, as in some sense, you would be surprised if it didn't, greater political influence and control over its environment. It's what great powers do. And China is no exception. And it will seek to translate its wealth and growing power in hegemonic influence across the region and the world globally. So the United States would be crazy not to think about that as its own, the most important step or shift in its own strategic environment. So when Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan are talking about the coming rivalry, it doesn't depend on identifying a particular document or a speech. It's a structural reality that comes from what we call power transition dynamics. And that I think is the underlying force that is making every country adjust and rethink its interests. So I think that's the reality, and it's something that can be managed. I don't think we have to. It doesn't have to be something that takes us into to the brink of war. I think managing peaceful accommodation, navigating the Taiwan issue. I mean, if China were to use force to try to retake Taiwan, that would upend the global system. And we should be as careful today as we can in laying the groundwork for stable coexistence between a democratic Taiwan that doesn't want to be gobbled up by China, and China that for reasons that have something to do with its own identity and nationalism feels like it cannot be successful as a global power until it subdues Taiwan. Again, therein lies the rub. And I think that's where careful diplomacy, rules of the road, and yes, international law and these wonderful contrivances of two China policy, things that create ambiguity and allow for the perpetuation of unsettled issues like Taiwan to go forward without war. So those kinds of diplomatic, collective diplomatic efforts are going to be very important to keep the peace in East Asia. And that's going to be, the difficulty will increasingly grow as China's position, its economic position, its military position advance.
Okay, Stein Tønnesson. Okay, it is a question by Olivier Rockens. Okay, when talking about China-US rivalry, people often refer to the Thucydides trap or Kindleberger trap. Thucydides trap was proposed by Graham Allison, and Kindleberger trap was proposed by John I. Okay, you may all know about Thucydides trap, but the Kindleberger trap simply means the mismatch of hegemonic ascension and the provision, a failure to provide public goods international arena, like what happened in the early part of 20th century, which led to the so-called First World War. Anyhow, therefore, which trap do you think is more likely to happen between the US and China? If neither apply, in your opinion, and what and how will the transfer of hegemonic position go? Will we enter a new bipolar world with Cold War characteristics, or a unipolar with China being the sole hegemon? Or will the US remain hegemon without, but simply lose influence? It's a long question, but Stein, you are smart enough to make a quick and short answer.
I'm somewhat influenced by a recent article in Foreign Policy by two authors. I don't remember the name of them, but they are publishing a book called China's Danger Zone, where they criticize the Thucydides trap because it, in a way, builds on the fear of the hegemon when another one is rising. But in this article, they instead talk about the kind of fear that sets in when you lose power, when you feel that power is running out between your fingers. And if there is a sudden backlash for China, where China expects to continue its growth, but feels that now it's losing, then if there is a kind of internal political crisis in China at the same time, then that could be dangerous. And it could also, you could also imagine similar developments in the United States. The United States does not only have a bipolar worldview, but also has a bipolar internal political system, which has shown its dysfunctionalism. And if there is a situation where suddenly there is an desperation in the American public and elite because they see China bypassing, that could give the United States a chance as well. And I've often argued that will create a risk of US initiatives. And there is one thing I've sometimes pointed out to Chinese colleagues, and that's how Taiwan represents an Achilles heel for China, because China is determined to use force against Taiwan if Taiwan declares its independence. This means that if the United States should decide that it wants a confrontation with China because China has become too strong, then it could just whisper a word in the ears of the Taiwanese leaders that now you can have a referendum. And if they then organize a referendum, they have every right in international democratic thinking to be respected. If they then suffer a Chinese attack, then the United States could immediately retaliate. But this is all speculation. The main thing about all of this is to try to get China and the United States back to cooperation and to speak about something different than rivalry. Competition is a better term, I think.
Thank you. Now, Wang Dong wanted to just, wanted to make an intervention. He wanted to respond to John's comments on question 1 as well. Okay, Wang Dong, make a quick, comments and questions, okay. John.
Sure. To be short, I think China. My understanding is that China's goal, what China's sort of aiming to become, is one of the global leading powers, but not really global hegemony. I mean, the world is fed up with American hegemony. Why does China want to contend for the global hegemony and become the one to be hated by everyone? And it really doesn't make sense. And I think the Chinese leaders are quite rational to arrive at the conclusion that the global hegemony is not the goal that China is contending for.
Okay, John, do you want to respond to the Wang Dong? China does not want to seek in the hegemony, okay? And since the Bandung Conference in 1955, China has been, shutting down or rejecting any kinds of hegemony moves. Therefore, China has been champion of anti-hegemonism. What is your take on that position?
I think that it's not. It's the world we are entering in is one where leading states use their power to shape their international environments. The United States is very keen on doing that, and China is clearly doing that in all sorts of different ways. It is extending its reach. It is using its network of diplomatic and other forms of influence to shape its environment. It's actively cultivating relations in Africa and Latin America. It's playing an important role in United Nations peacekeeping. It's elevating its presence in the world, and we can welcome a great deal of that. That's something that is both inevitable and something that will be important. We can't escape the fact that in the decades ahead, we will live in a world where there will be several superpowers, and the US and China, and I would say Europe has an opportunity to be a force as well at the global level, helping to shape rules and institutions. Hegemony is a term that is conveys a sense of leadership, of working with other states to crystallize shared rules and institutions that promulgate values and interests that you want to promulgate. And China will do it, and the United States will do it, and therein will be the rivalry. It is something that is built into being powerful states. I don't think the world is sick of American hegemony. I think you have to look over the last 70 years and see how the US has acted as a global superpower in a way different than powers of the past have. It has tied itself to building regional and multilateral institutions. Talk to Germany and Japan, talk to South Korea, who in public opinion polls embrace the US Korean alliance and see it as something that's important in navigating its own regional security. So the world has wanted more rather than less leadership. And when the United States takes a turn, as it did under President Trump, where the US in a puzzling way was attacking its own global leadership position and trying to take a wrecking ball to the rules and institutions that it has invested in over the last 70 years, the world looked on in horror and held its breath during the 2020 election, wondering what the world would look like if the United States had a second 4 years of Trump. So it matters what great powers look like. Their domestic systems matter. China is going to be a powerful state. And it's precisely because it's going to be more powerful in the future than less powerful that we care about the nature of China. We care about how it treats Hong Kong and the young students who are attacked because all they want is freedom of expression. China violated its agreement with Hong Kong, and the Taiwanese, as Stein has said, have taken notice of that. China has to get its own house in order if it wants to be a respected, collaborative, global superpower. And so too does the United States. So it's
okay,
not just...
John. Okay, then there is one question to Wang Dong by Eun-Kyo Lee. Okay, what Eun-Kyo Lee is saying is this: Li Jiansu, the president of Chinese Congress, recently stated that we should strengthen theoretical research and the propaganda interpretation of socialist democracy with Chinese characteristics and the People's Congress system, and tell good stories about China's democracy. I would love to know your interpretation on this democratic construct of China. And if you could, please elaborate on the story of Chinese democracy. Wang Dong, that is really related to John Ikenberry's response too.
Exactly. Thank you, Ms. Lee. Happy to take this question. I think there are a couple of points. Number one, I think what China insists is there ought to be more than one definition of what democracy is. The American style democracy may be just one of the kind of many kinds of democracies. And I think in that context, I think we should also be, I think a dose of healthy suspicion probably is also needed when it comes to the what I see as a very simplistic narrative of democracy versus authoritarianism. The kind of very simple dichotomy to divide the words, into different groups. I think a dose of healthy suspicion is probably is helpful here. And what China most recently, very interestingly, coincidentally, President Xi also gave a long speech illustrating his view or Chinese view of what democracy should be. And it's a very interesting speech. I encourage you to look at that. And the key point argument is that what China trying to achieve is what is called 过程, 全过程民主, the whole process democracy. Yes, in the West, in the United States, you got elections, democracy in form. But do you also have accountability? Sometimes the voters are very disappointed. They could do nothing about that. Once you elect someone very stupid, very foolish and very corrupt, and there little you can do about it. However, in terms of accountability, let me also share with you some story. You probably will be amazed, like one ordinary mayor in China, he would receive, and return thousands of calls every year, which means at least dozens of calls from the ordinary citizens, and asking for, helping solve any problems you can imagine. And that's what a mayor in China, he would have to care about. And this is, I think, what the government here in China is trying to deliver to the people. And lastly, I also would like to cite, this is also quite well publicized. I think the Harvard University did a global polling, asking people about their approval rate, whether they're happy, satisfied with their government or not. In China, Chinese people, I think over 80% of Chinese people happy with the services that government provides to them. And in terms of Hong Kong, let me just very briefly, I would like to say, Hong Kong's story is not about democracy. It's about
We have a problem with Wang Dong. We can recall him later, okay? Okay, now, then Wang Dong, we can set him aside for a while, okay, until he comes back. Okay, we have, the questions by Eunbin Cho and Minu Nam, both raised the same questions. It's to John and Wang Dong, okay? How does the pandemic influence the geopolitical and ideological competition between China and the United States? Okay, and did the pandemic exacerbate the decoupling, or did it have no effect at all? Maybe John, you can start first.
Can I just say a little bit about Wang Dong's point about democracy in China?
Please do that. Yeah.
I always admire the creativity of theorists who take autocratic regimes and try to describe them as democracies. I think China should defend its model of politics and economics, but calling it a democracy doesn't help us understand what it is, I'm afraid. Maybe I'm too provincial in my understanding of liberal democracy, but I think, and this is not just an American view, it's liberal democracy is something that has merged out of the Enlightenment. It is centuries in the making. It has lots of different variations, but I don't see how you can be a democracy without at least three things. One is free and independent press, an independent judiciary, and a civil society outside the reach of an authoritarian state. And if you don't have those three features, then it's impossible for a government to be a we the people government. And China doesn't have any of those things. So I think China should defend its model, and President Xi can make a case, a moral case for this is the way we think our government should be. But I don't think it should be called a democracy. On the second issue, the pandemic. I think the pandemic has accelerated all the trends that we've been talking about today. It's made the system look, and it's illuminated the failures really of our global governance system. It's shown us that we are woefully unprepared for the problems of the 21st century. it's striking. And for those of us who study the history of the modern era, how much today we are threatened by a kind of erosion of a shared belief in our ability to collectively organize our affairs. The WHO, the institutions that were put up in an earlier era precisely for these problems are suffering from an absence of cooperative spirit. And of course, this is similar in the climate change area. So I think that it's a wake-up call that we are going to have to organize the international system in ways to cope with the next pandemic, because it will surely come our way, even as we suffer increasingly from climate change. My own view is that if we are to turn the corner on and not just compete as superpowers, that China and the United States could find ways to agree on, we'll call them global governance norms. And I would have a series of principles that we might try to agree on. One is transparency, that in an era where pandemics come from very specific places and very specific practices, laboratories, wet markets, places where nature and human activity interact with each other, not for the better, that in those circumstances, transparency is important, because those of us living thousands of miles away from where this virus began are victims of that virus. And we have a stake in what happens in terms of public health in that country where the virus came from. And it doesn't matter what country it is. We all are in the same boat together in that regard. So transparency, accountable government, that when a government fails to deliver on promises, that there's some accountability, peer review, and best practices. We should be surveying the world for examples of when governments do things inside of their country or between countries in ways that seem to be at the highest level of performance.
Okay, John.
So that's our agenda, I think, Chung-in, for turning the corner and rebuilding cooperation.
Okay, Wang Dong, do you have any response to it? Wang Dong, okay.
Yes.
A quick response to that, and well, what is your take on the whole geopolitical and ideological competition between China and the US with regard to the pandemic?
Sure. Before I get to that, I just very quickly, I think, I think John gave a very powerful definition of what liberal democracy is. But when it comes to what democracy is, I think probably I would think that back to differ. I think that there's probably more diversity in terms of how democracy should be defined. Pandemic, I think you're right. I think the pandemic has unfortunately has added to the tension between China and the United States. And a lot of the one thing I feel very, and many of my colleagues I know, they share this concern. It's very unfortunate that the politicization of the COVID really prevented the scientists from two countries collaborate together and try to do the benefit of the people in both countries and the whole world, just to how to counter this pandemic. And also, I think the vaccine, in my own personal view, my humble view, should not become a political weapon. I think that really it should be another area, potential area where China and United States can work together. But unfortunately, as of now, it seems to me Washington still look at this issue from a political perspective, rather from a provision of global public goods, as John just very powerfully the point you made. I very much agree. These are the new norms we should all work together.
Okay, now it is also true, the Wang Dong. Okay, what is Chinese policy on Central Asia and Mongolia? Recently, for example, you had an energy crisis, and you have been trying to get a coal from Mongolia. Okay, and also maybe this, what role will South Korea play in between the two powers? Can it continue to play the neutral role, or a matter of time until Korea joins under balancing against China with alliance like Quad and AUKUS? I will respond to that one. Okay, why don't you respond first? What is your policy on Central Asia and Mongolia?
Okay, I think China's its goal of improving its relations with Central Asia, I think part of that, the logic is about hedging. It's really, try to reduce the potential risks that China will be exposed to in terms of energy supply. I think that's really top the agenda. So a lot of economic cooperation between China and Central Asia are between energy security issue. Another one is that China also has been in the past few years working closely with Central Asia states, trying to extend the Belt and Road Initiative through Central Asia. I think that's also another I think goal in the Chinese its approach towards Central Asia.
And also, Wang Dong, your answer to the whole this Li Jianshu's statement, whole this socialist democracy with the Chinese characteristics. You answered in terms of diversity and universality.
Right. No, I think the whole concept is Chinese understanding this democracy, socialist democracy with Chinese characteristics. I think is this idea of that having people at the center. This is actually in the 19th Party Congress document. This is the everything should be measured against whether people are welfare are being taken care of, whether or not the government, the party has successfully delivered the kind of services to the people, whether the officials are held accountable. John mentioned that. And those are things are the key components of Chinese definition of democracy, what democracy is.
Okay. Now, Stein, the question, from what the Li Yongyo, you talked about how you emphasize the role of international organizations and United Nations in promoting, global universal values and etc. But you can clearly see the contradiction between United Nations in the right to intervention and individual countries' sovereignty and autonomy. How can you reconcile, the tension between the two?
This is a very tough question to resolve and an obvious dilemma in many cases. I think the rule that we have that an intervention requires a mandate from the UN Security Council is a pretty good rule. It's not in any way ideal, because there can be cases where there should be an intervention for obvious reasons, in case of genocide, for instance, and where a veto power in the United Nations Security Council will oppose it. And there could be cases also where there are not sufficient grounds for intervention, but where the country that is the victim of an intervention is a very small one, so that you could get a mandate from the United Nations Security Council. So it's not sure, but I think it's the best that we have.
Okay, let me answer to the so-called Korean role, neutral role between China and the United States. The current Moon Jae-in government's position is very clear. Okay, we honor and we are more than happy to maintain alliance with the United States, but we cannot, give up our strategic cooperative partnership with China. And the current government believes that, it can pursue, both dual strategy. Okay, of course, the time will come, then South Korea might have to choose between the two. But the South Korean government, even if the conservative wins the next president's election, it will be in the same position. They will try to minimize the conflict and tension between, pro-American balancing strategy and the so-called bandwagoning China strategy. But the South Korea will not take the bandwagoning China strategy. Also, it cannot pursue, explicit, pro-American balancing strategy either. But it will try to muddle through between the two. Meanwhile, it will try to, come up with an international effort to prevent the advance of a new Cold War between Washington and Beijing. Therefore, it can be very opportunistic, but in light of its national interest, there might be quite natural choice. Okay, now Kwon Se-jin. It seems that the Biden administration emphasized the pro-US alliance rather than considering the interest of world to keep China in check. I wonder whether the Biden administration truly pursues internationalism and multilateralism. In fact, there is a question to John, but there is a growing suspicion that the Biden administration is not necessarily liberal internationalist in a government, because it pursues neo-mercantilism for American middle class. Okay, and also multilateralism is nothing but the new rationale to promote and strengthen American alliances. How do you respond to that kind of critiques from South Korea?
Well, that's a great question, and that is an issue widely debated today, and we're all looking at the Biden administration and trying to see what the underlying vision is. And I think the most important new initiative or argument about American foreign policy that has been brought to the table by the Biden administration is this sense that internationalism has to be rooted in domestic politics. That one of the reasons why the liberal international order has entered troubled times is that it doesn't seem to be delivering on providing better life opportunities for everyday people living everyday lives, the middle class, if you will. And that's, of course, the hallmark of the order after World War II, that it was a liberal order that accommodated social democracy, the social safety net, worker opportunities. So it was never totally just free trade and let the domestic chips fall where they may. It was always a modified system, and that system from the Reagan era onward eroded, and it became what we call neoliberalism, where the domestic societal constituencies for internationalism suffered from the order. And so what I think Biden is trying to do is reconnect the middle class with internationalism. And we can't simply have an internationalist America if it's just run out of the Council on Foreign Relations or the State Department or a few think tanks in Washington. It has to be rooted in a larger consensus. So I think that's what is the argument for why it looks like mercantilism when it's really trying to reestablish what we call embedded liberalism, and that globalization is not an end goal. Interdependence is not greater interdependence is not the goal of American foreign policy, never has been, or anybody else. It's managed interdependence to get the gains from interdependence while guarding against the downside. Globalization, exchange can do great things, but it can also create instabilities, and managing that trade-off is of course what we call global governance.
Okay,
so that's I think it's a fairly straightforward vision.
Okay, final question from the Isan Jewel from the NK News. Do the panelists see the North Korean problem as an opportunity for collaboration between the US and China, or rather a source of inextricable tension and conflict? Short questions from John and Wang and Stein.
I think we could see it as something where we can weave it into our cooperative efforts to stabilize relations in Northeast Asia, a return to the five-party talks to bring Japan, China, South Korea, the United States, and Russia back to the table to think about how to move the negotiations over denuclearization of North Korea forward, and the kind of bargains and deals that will have to be part of that overall process. Multilateralizing it that was our vision a few years ago, Chung, and you and I talked a lot about this some years back when we were both on the same page about these multilateral talks. And I think, maybe the time has come for that to return.
Okay, Wang Dong.
Sure. I'm very glad to hear John approves this idea of six-party talks, 5+1. And this is also what China has been advocating so hard over the years. And I do think that China and United States and other stakeholders like South Korea, we do have shared interest in the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And China actually has proposed this dual strategy, which is on the one hand, trying to negotiate the denuclearization issue. On the other hand, trying to also strive for the security architecture in Northeast Asia. I think that is also a very, from what I see as is a quite a sensible strategy. Hopefully, I think there will be a moment that China, United States, South Korea, Japan, Russia, and we can come all together, and North Korea as well. We can resume this denuclearization talks.
Fine.
I was very supportive of Donald Trump's North Korea policy, because he understood that North Korea is run by one person and that you need to have a personal diplomacy directly with that person, Kim Jong-un. And one of the effects of Trump's approachment to Pyongyang was to improve Sino-North Korean relations, because he opened the door for Kim Jong-un to also meet Xi Jinping. And he actually met Xi Jinping more times than he met Trump. I think Biden must do the same. He cannot trust special envoys or anyone to do this work for him. The only way to make it work in North Korea is to deal directly with the top leader. And Biden should also talk with Xi Jinping about it. I definitely see a potential for cooperation between China and the United States if they could only dare to do it and have the necessary trust in each other.
Yeah, I agree, with you, because the issue of North Korean, the with the so-called the issue of the denuclearization of North Korea is so vital and existential issue for all of us. Therefore, it is must, not whether of choice, for China and the United States to cooperate together. Without a bilateral cooperation between Beijing and Washington, there is no solution to the North Korean nuclear problem. Okay, it was very fascinating discussion. By way of concluding the session, let me put this final words. Recently, I read a very interesting article by Paul Heers in National Interest. He argues that the current chaotic situation between Washington and Beijing is a result of strategic paranoia, which is littered with hubris, insecurity, nasty domestic politics, mistrust, and misunderstanding. And he urges all the parties concerned to have a strategic empathy, particularly between Washington and Beijing. And I think that his wording of strategic paranoia and strategic empathy were extremely appealing to me. And I think we got to really think about those two terminologies. Really, those leadership and elite in Washington and Beijing tend to be really, fell into the trapping structure of this strategic paranoia. I'll start with this. Okay, John Delury, not John Ikenberry. Okay, we have two Johns. John.
Thank you so much, Professor Moon, for moderating, for guiding that discussion, and thank you to the panelists. Strategic empathy is a really good concept to end with, and to do empathy, we have to listen to all sides, to the other side. We have to have someone there who will make the case vigorously but respectfully of the other, and that was showcased by this panel tonight. So I want to compliment the four of you. I learned a lot from this discussion, and I'm sure our audience did. I also feel I should add and take full personal responsibility. I apologize that we ended up with an all-male panel. Those of you who know me know that that's something that I care a lot about and think we all have to work on. And so I want to make it clear that's not the fault of any of the panelists. But I also can say on a positive note that going forward, we have gender parity for the remainder of the sessions. So we will be doing better on that score. We hope you will all join us. Tune in again in about 11 hours or so from now for the second session. It will be the morning here in Asia. It'll be tomorrow morning in Asia. It'll be tonight for those of you in the United States. Stein and others in Europe, I think, will be asleep, unfortunately, but that's time zones. We have a great second session coming up with Maria Repnikova from Georgia State University talking about Chinese soft power and the rivalry over values. We have our colleague Li Hijin here at Yonsei talking about technology and the tech battle between the US and China. We have Myun Oh from the Atlantic Council talking about the geoeconomic aspect or arena of rivalry. And lastly, Ryan Haas, who will be talking about the geopolitics of it, the author of a great book, Stronger, and a really interesting and important thinker about US-China relations in the US. So that's next. All of you who joined us, I hope you'll join again. And finally, I do want to thank the Asia Research Fund one more time for making this whole thing possible. So thank you to the panel, thank you to the audience, and we'll see you tomorrow tonight.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good night,
Thank you,
everyone.
John. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye-bye,
Great
John.
panel.
Stein.
Thanks, Chung-in. Good to see you.
Great to
Nice
see
seeing you, John. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, John.
Stein.
Bye-bye, Stein.
Bye-bye.